As we begin to talk about Book 2, it is important to recapitulate some of the themes from Book 1. Remember that the first definition of justice in Book 1 is giving someone what is due to them. Justice is giving someone their due. And the second definition has to do with benefiting friends and harming enemies. That second definition also has to do with what it might be that is due to somebody. So it's still this idea of justice as giving someone justice is giving somebody what is due to them. Even when we have the definition provided by Thrasymachus that justice is the advantage of the stronger, what we are talking about is what it is that is due to somebody. And supposedly here the idea is that justice is what is due, is what is due to the stronger person, and that's advantage. So we're, throughout all of these definitions, still talking about the same thing. And in that first book, several issues come up. And these are important to keep in mind as we look at what's going on in the second book. The first issue has to do with the fact that we can be mistaken as to who our real friends and enemies are. And if we can be mistaken as to who our real friends and enemies are, we would then be mistaken as to what is due to those people. Secondly, we can be mistaken as to what it is that is really beneficial. If we do not understand what it is that is really beneficial, then we would not be able to give another person what is their due. It is then in the context of what is really beneficial, or what it is that is really the good, that Glaucon's challenge begins to make sense. At the beginning of Book 2, Glaucon tells Socrates that Thrasymachus was very easy to rout. Glaucon is going to try to defend Thrasymachus's position with much stronger and clearer arguments. So one of the things that he tells us, he says, "For I want to hear what justice and injustice are, and what power each has when it is just by itself in the soul. I want to leave out of account the wages and the consequences of each." So he wants to see if Socrates can prove that justice is something that is intrinsically good, that it is something that can be loved for its own sake, and not simply for its consequences. At the beginning of Book 2, Glaucon will argue that there are three kinds of goods. The first are those things that are desired for their own sake. And these can be things such as harmless pleasures. So if you see a beautiful bird out in the yard, you enjoy it, and you enjoy that for its own sake. Or let's say that you listen to a piece of music, and it's just enjoyable in the moment. That is something that is desired for its own sake. There's another class of goods, and that is those things desired both for their own sake and for their consequences. So it's something that is both intrinsically good, but also brings good consequences, other desirable consequences in its train. And then the third class of goods are going to be those things that are desired for their consequences only. What are those things that are desired for their consequences only? Well, for instance, we go to the dentist. It's not a very pleasant experience, but we do want to have health. And so in order to have health, we need to take care of our cavities and so forth. Or if you go to the doctor, for instance, right, that might and get an unpleasant shot or an unpleasant operation. Nobody does that for its own sake, but you do it for its consequences. We need to understand what kind of thing justice is in order to see under what class of goods it falls. Is justice just something that is loved for its consequences and cannot be loved for its own sake? Is it something like going to the dentist, something then that we do unwillingly? We just do it because we need to do it, but we do not like to do it. Or can justice be something that, again, is in itself beneficial? So what's going to happen is that Glaucon is going to give the best definition of justice that he can that is going to support Thrasymachus's position. And then, given this definition, he's going to show that all who practice justice do so unwillingly. So what is the definition of justice that he's going to give? Let's look at, he says, this is going to be at 358E. Now, listen to what I said I was going to discuss first. What justice is like and what its origins are. People say, you see, that to do injustice is naturally good and to suffer injustice bad. But the badness of suffering it far exceeds the goodness of doing it. Hence, those who have done and suffered injustice and who have tasted both, the ones who lack the power to do it and avoid suffering it, decide that it is profitable to come to an agreement with each other, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. As a result, they begin to make laws and covenants, and what the law commands they call lawful and just. That, they say, is the origin and the very being of justice. It is in between the best and the worst. The best is to do injustice without paying the penalty. The worst is to suffer it without being able to take revenge. Justice is in the middle between these two extremes. People love it, not because it is a good thing, but because they are too weak to do injustice with impunity. Someone who has the power to do it, however, someone who is truly a man, would not make an agreement with anyone, and neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. For him, that would be insanity. That is the nature of justice according to the argument, Socrates, and those are its natural origins. So what we have here is going to be basically a social contract theory of justice. This is a theory that, for instance, we find developed later on by Hobbes. So that we have this idea that human beings in the state of nature are always in conflict with one another, vying with one another. There are no laws. In the state of nature, according to Hobbes, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And again, that is because people are not cooperating with one another. They're always getting in each other's way. It's a perpetual war of all against all. And so people realize that the state of nature is just such a terrible thing because they would be suffering injustice from other people. So again, in a state of nature, everyone is always against everybody else. There are no agreements that are respected amongst people. There are no institutions, and therefore no action in concert. So this is, I think, what Glaucon is getting at when he says that in this state, he says, the ones who lack the power to do injustice and avoid suffering it decide that it is profitable to come to an agreement with each other, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. And as a result, they begin to make laws and covenants. So then the idea of justice here is basically that it is the result of these agreements or laws and covenants that are made by people in order to get out of the state of nature. Justice then only exists insofar as there are laws and covenants. And as such, justice is something that arises out of human activity. It does not exist independently of those laws and covenants. We can't talk about some sort of form of justice or ideal justice. It just is what we happen to have come to an agreement about, or only exists insofar as we have these laws that we have agreed upon. Now, if this is the nature and origins of justice, it then follows that justice is only going to be something that is loved for its consequences. It is not loved for its own sake. So Glaucon tells us then, we can see most clearly that those who practice it do so unwillingly because they lack the power to do injustice. If we imagine the following thought experiment. So So basically, the idea then is, if what we have is a social contract theory of justice, people are going to practice justice or follow the laws only because of the consequences of what it would mean not to have those laws, or the consequences of being punished by the city or the state when they don't follow the laws. So it's only for the consequences. And justice is here not loved for its own sake. Now, what are the consequences of justice, or of being just? They would be the same consequences that would come from appearing to be just. So if you appear to be a just person, you have a great deal of clout, you receive respect from others, you get a certain amount of honor from appearing to be a just person. So now it's in the context of this, right, that we're going to be looking at Glaucon's experiment. This experiment is put together in order to isolate the motives for being just. And so what Glaucon has us think of is a situation in which an unjust person reaps all the rewards of appearing just. So he appears just, and then other people trust him or her, and through the trust of other people, that person is able to acquire a great deal of power over others, right? So the consequences of appearing just are going to have to do a lot with all of these social goods of respect and honor and power that you can wield in society. So then, if an individual appears to be just, he or she can reap all the rewards of appearing just without actually valuing justice for its own sake. So the person is just going to want to pretend to be just, and that's enough to pretend. What they really want is that honor, is that power, is the ability to use institutions, to function within the context of those institutions and laws in order to acquire their own ends. So justice in that situation is not loved for its own sake, but only for its consequences. So let me just read you now the story of the Ring of Gyges, which is again a story that is supposed to help us isolate the motives for justice. So this is at 359D, and the story goes like this. They would especially have the freedom I am talking about if they had the power that the ancestor of Gyges of Lydia is said to have possessed. The story goes that he was a shepherd in the service of the ruler of Lydia. There was a violent thunderstorm, and an earthquake broke open the ground and created a chasm at the place where he was tending his sheep. Seeing this, he was filled with amazement and went down into it. And there, in addition to many other amazing things of which we are told stories, he saw a hollow bronze horse. There were window-like openings in it, and peeping in, he saw a corpse, which seemed to be of more than human size, wearing nothing but a gold ring on its finger. He took off the ring and came out of the chasm. He wore the ring at the usual monthly meeting of shepherds that reported to the king on the state of the flocks. And as he was sitting among the others, he happened to turn the setting of the ring toward himself, towards the inside of his hand. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting near him, and they went on talking as if he had gone. He was amazed at this, and fingering the ring, he turned the setting outward again and became visible. So he experimented with the ring to test whether it indeed had this power, and it did. If he turned the setting inward, he became invisible. If he turned it outward, he became visible again. As soon as he realized this, he arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. On arriving there, he seduced the king's wife, attacked the king with her help, killed him, and in this way took over the kingdom. So, of course, this is a ring of power. And if you're wondering where Tolkien got the story for the Lord of the Rings, he was a classicist and he got it from Plato. But the idea here is that you have this individual with a ring of power, and because the individual has the ring of power, he or she can reap all the consequences of justice without actually being just. And here then, he continues, let's suppose then that there were two such rings, one worn by the just person, the other by the unjust. Now no one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice, or bring himself to keep away from other people's possessions and not touch them, when he could take whatever he wanted from the marketplace with impunity, go into people's houses and have sex with anyone he wished, kill or release from prison anyone he wished, and do all other things that would make him like a god among the humans. So in other words, the challenge here is, Glaucon is saying, nobody who could have all the consequences of justice and have all of that power would ever choose justice for its own sake. So that absolute power is going to corrupt anybody, and nobody just has that strength to love justice for its own sake. Now, the second situation that he talks about is at 361c, and he tells us this: having hypothesized such a person, let's now put the just man next to him in our argument. So this is the second scenario. Someone who is simple and noble, and who, as Aeschylus says, does not want to be believed to be good, but to be so. We must take away his reputation, for a reputation for justice would bring him honor and rewards, so that it would not be clear whether he is being just for the sake of justice or for the sake of those honors and rewards. So you see, again, here's the thought experiment. And what we're doing is trying to isolate motivation. That's the point of this thought experiment. We must strip him of everything except justice and make his situation the opposite of the unjust person's. Though he does no injustice, he must have the greatest reputation for it, so that he may be tested with regard to justice by seeing whether or not he can withstand a bad reputation and its consequences. Let him stay like that, unchanged until he is dead, just, but all his life believed to be unjust. In this way, both will reach the extremes, the one of justice and the other of injustice, and we will be able to judge which of them is happier. So again, here we also not only have the question of trying to isolate the motives, but we also see that part of what is going on here in this attempt to isolate motives is the question of whether justice is an intrinsic good, and as such somehow can be valued for its own sake and make an individual happy or eudaimon. Is the individual who is just for its own sake, for the sake of justice, and only has justice, doesn't have any of the consequences of justice, is that going to make the individual happy? Or is it the consequences of justice that make people happy, right? So the issue is what has to do with what can be desired. Can it be the case that justice can be desired for its own sake? And if it can be desired for its own sake, then having it is going to fulfill the individual in some way. That's why we want to ask whether the individual who loves justice for its own sake, but who has been deprived of all of the consequences of justice, can in some way be happy. And so it's in this context that we have this extreme case that is being talked about here. And he continues, and if what I say sounds crude, Socrates, remember that it is not I who speak, but those who praise injustice at the expense of justice. They will say that the just person in such circumstances will be whipped, stretched on a rack, chained, blinded with a red-hot iron, and at the end, when he has suffered every sort of bad thing, he will be impaled, and will realize then that no one should not want to be just, but to be believed to be just. So the question is then, can somebody who is in that situation where everything has been taken from them, the only thing that remains is the inner quality of the soul, can that be something that fulfills the self in such a way that it can be desired for its own sake, because it is a good that in some way fulfills the self, even when all the external goods have been taken away? So now we compare the case of an individual who is maximally unjust and is able at the same time to reap all of the rewards of appearing just, with the completely opposite case. In this case, you have an individual who is truly just, who loves justice for its own sake, but who has been deprived of all of the consequences of justice. Now, in order to answer this question of whether justice can indeed be loved for its own sake, what we need to do is to identify what justice is. And once we identify it, we can see then if it by itself, as it is by itself, can fulfill the soul, can make the individual happy, or eudaimon. This concludes this video on the first part of Book 2 of the Republic. In my next lecture, I'll be discussing what justice is and Socrates' attempt to delineate it in terms of what he calls the big and the small letters. Good night, and I will see you tomorrow.